But to get things going here, hello, my name is Edward. I am the president of Chicago Ornithological Society, and I am super excited for our guest speaker here today, Sophie Osborn. This is part of Chicago Ornithological Society's 2024 celebration of the Year of the Peregrine. This marks 25 years of the peregrine falcon being the official bird of the city of Chicago. And so we have been hosting this series of events, in-person, virtual field trips all year long to celebrate this milestone of sorts. And today's program will be featuring a wildlife biologist and author who has done much work and time with this species. And so we'll be hearing some stories about her work with peregrine falcons. In the meantime, just as a reminder, please keep yourselves muted and cameras off during the presentation. At the end of the presentation, we'll have time for questions, but please feel free in the meantime, if questions strike you, to put them in the chat. So that way we don't miss them, or we can call upon you later, or you don't go, oh, darn, what was I thinking before? It's right there for us to reference, and we can get to it, and we can remember to ask that question. Additionally, if you're not already a member of Chicago Ornithological Society, why the heck not? It's an amazing organization that offers free programs just like this one here, and really is the best bang for your bird or bucks. It's cheaper than this bottle of wine that I just opened up here. So seriously, hop on over to chicagobirder.org, not only to become a member and see all the other cool things going on, but also view all the other amazing events we have lined up for the Year of the Peregrine this year. But with that said, you didn't come here to listen to me ramble. I'll go ahead and wrap it up, and I will pass it off to Sophie Osborn, our guest speaker for the evening. Take it away, Sophie.
Thank you. Let me share my screen. Done. Okay. Can everyone see that? We all set? Okay. Thank you for inviting me to celebrate the 25th anniversary of Chicago's official city bird, the beautiful, the inimitable peregrine falcon, by talking about my newly released book. It sounds like you've been having some great events. I was talking to Edward at the beginning about how envious I am about some of your birding trips around Chicago to see peregrines. I think your city picked the perfect bird representative. The peregrine falcon has captivated humanity for thousands of years, and I think it's rare for anyone to see a peregrine for the first time and not be moved by it. I can speak from personal experience on this, as I discuss in my new book, Feather Trails, A Journey of Discovery Among Endangered Birds, which just came out on May 2nd. Feather Trails describes my journey into the amazing world of birds, and it all began with peregrines. This book is in part a personal story about becoming and being a wildlife biologist. It takes you behind the scenes, and it shows you what it's like to reintroduce captive raised birds to the wild in order to save 3 endangered species. In the process, the book illuminates the threats that imperiled these and other birds. My focus tonight will mainly be on peregrine falcons, since that's the bird that we're celebrating, but I will also spend a bit of time talking about these other 2 species that I write about, since recovering endangered peregrines help set the stage for our efforts to save these species too. In addition, the peregrine story taught us important lessons about conserving other endangered birds like the Hawaiian crow and the California condor. In the early 1900s, miners began taking canaries down into the coal mines because the birds were highly sensitive to toxic gases like carbon monoxide. If the birds keeled over, it was a sign that the miners should leave the mine immediately because the air quality had become dangerous. Today, our wild birds are the canaries in the coal mine that alert us to environmental harms through their declining populations or their failure to thrive. Because birds are so visible and vocal, it's relatively easy to monitor them and determine if their populations are doing well or declining. And when birds are disappearing, it behooves us to figure out why, because if we can resolve a problem that's been harming birds and help them, we often end up helping other organisms that have been negatively affected as well, including often us. The peregrine falcon is a top-level predator that feeds mainly on birds, and it's found on every continent except for Antarctica. It occurs in a wide variety of open habitats, from the Arctic tundra to mountains and desert canyons, from coastal cliffs to our biggest cities like Chicago and New York. Today, peregrines are found wherever there are suitable nest sites, which consist of high ledges on cliffs, buildings, or structures like bridges. The picture on the left is a peregrine territory in my neighborhood in Montana. Today, peregrines have long been revered by people, from the pyramid building Egyptians to today's birders. And these birds have been used for falconry for about 4,000 years. Falconers capture wild raptors like peregrines, tame them, and then use them for hunting game. For centuries, peregrines were a sought-after status symbol. In more recent times, though, the falcons were viewed less favorably, often as competitors for game, and many were killed before legislation finally protected them. In the US, peregrines first received federal protections in 1970. But by then, very few peregrines actually remained, because beginning in the 1950s, peregrines began disappearing at an alarming rate. Their disappearance was first confirmed by a British biologist named Derek Ratcliffe, who completed peregrine surveys in 1962. He discovered abandoned peregrine territories and also found lots of broken eggs in peregrine nests, which was something that had never been seen before. And he realized that peregrines weren't successfully raising young. After hearing about the dramatic decline of peregrines in Britain, a US biologist named Joe Hickey, who was a student of Aldo Leopold's and who wrote the first ever guide to birdwatching, which I thought would be of interest to all of us, he launched a peregrine survey in the eastern US in 1964. During that summer, biologists surveyed every known territory east of the Mississippi River, from Alabama up to Nova Scotia, and they didn't find a single peregrine. The eastern peregrine had completely disappeared. A follow-up conference in Madison, Wisconsin in 1965 brought together scientists, falconers, and naturalists from around the world. People reported peregrine declines in 36 countries and on 5 continents. And biologists were soon calling the collapse of peregrine populations an ecological disaster. At the conference, several British scientists presented the first preliminary evidence that pesticides might be involved in peregrine declines. A new pesticide known as DDT had been used very successfully in World War II to control insect-borne diseases, and it had come into widespread use after the war to control agricultural and forest insect pests. The British scientists showed that peregrines had disappeared from the same areas where DDT and other toxic pesticides were being heavily used. And this was admittedly tenuous evidence, but it inspired many Madison Conference attendees to go on to study the effects of pesticides on peregrines. Other attendees, including Tom Cade, who worked for Cornell University and later founded the conservation organization known as the Peregrine Fund, were eager to see if they could breed peregrines in captivity. This hadn't been done before for peregrines or for any other endangered birds at the time. And if captive breeding worked, they hoped that they could then reintroduce peregrines to the wild in places where pesticide use was less prevalent. These two approaches, research and policy work on DDT and captive rearing and reintroduction, ultimately became the two prongs of a massive conservation effort to save the peregrine falcon. Captive breeding was eventually successful, and peregrine reintroductions began in the East in 1974. By the time I headed to Wyoming in 1991, for my first summer of field work as a biologist, reintroducing captive reared peregrine falcons to the wild, the falcon had been reintroduced successfully to the east, and reintroductions were just ramping up in the west. I had only camped a few times when my field partner and I found ourselves living out of a tent on a ranch in grizzly bear country near Cody, Wyoming. We spent our first week of work monitoring and feeding 5 captive reared falcons that had been driven to our release site and then placed into a large plywood box known as a hack box. We had 3 males and 2 females, and the females, as with peregrines and many other birds of prey, were larger than the males. Each bird wore a differently colored identifying leg band so that we could tell them all apart. And being a budding young scientist, I had originally wanted to name them after their leg bands, so red, yellow, green, etc. But my field partner overruled me and named the birds after Egyptian gods and mythological figures. So you'll know where the names come from when I read a passage in a few moments. The hack box was anchored to the top of a small set of cliffs, about a 30-minute hike from our camp. And each day we fed the 5 young falcons dead quail, which we dropped through a chute into the box so they wouldn't see us feeding them. And we took notes on the birds' activities and growth. And while the birds were in the hack box, I had plenty of time during that first week to admire the many adaptations that make them supremely fast flyers and incredible predators. One of these adaptations has to do with their remarkable eyes. Peregrine's eyes are enormous. They take up about half of the bird's skull, and by comparison, our eyes take up about 5% of our cranium. If our eyes were the same proportion to our bodies as a peregrine's, they would be about 3 inches across and weigh about 4 pounds each. Larger eyes usually mean better vision because bigger eyes have bigger retinas with more light receptors, which allow for a better image. Raptor vision is about twice as sharp as ours when looking at distant objects, and it's believed that a peregrine can see a pigeon over 2 miles away. This gets a little complicated, but hopefully you can make sense of this slide. Day flying raptors see especially well because they have 2 small depressions known as foveae in each retina, where the projected images are the clearest. We and most other birds have just 1 fovea. The peregrine views close-up images with its shallow fovea, which is located at the back of the eye like ours, and this gives the bird its binocular vision. Peregrines focus on distant images using their deep fovea, which is located at the side of the eye near the bird's beak. The deep fovea acts like a telephoto lens and helps the birds judge the speed and distance of fast-moving prey. But to focus on these distant images, the bird has to turn its head to the side so that the deep fovea is pointed toward its target. So if you've ever seen a peregrine at a distance, you might have seen the bird turn its head away from you, and you might have thought that it either hadn't seen you or was just being very nonchalant, but it actually was turning its head to check you out. And many beginning falconers have thought that their bird was disengaged or was maybe dissing them because it kept turning its head away when they were approaching. But instead, the bird was watching them very closely. One last thing about peregrine eyes, which I thought was one of the most amazing things that I learned about the birds when writing this book. And don't worry about the small print on this slide. Just look at the pictures, and especially the picture in the green circle. So when a peregrine pursues a distant bird, as I've mentioned, it has to turn its head to the side to focus the image on its deep fovea. But in flight, a turned head produces drag because the head and body are less streamlined. So to maximize its speed, aerodynamics, and visual acuity when pursuing distant birds, the peregrine doesn't fly straight at them, but instead follows a curved flight path that allows it to keep the line of sight of its deep fovea pointed towards its prey. Once the falcon's close enough to see the prey with its less acute binocular vision, it straightens its path and flies directly at its target. And all this is happening at just an incredible speed. I'm sure you all know that the peregrine is the fastest animal in the world. When traveling, the peregrine flies a relatively sedate 25 to 35 miles per hour. In its higher speed, level flight, the peregrine speed is still comparable to that of many other birds, and typically ranges from about 40 to 70 miles per hour. Sharp-shinned hawks can pursue birds through dense forest at about 40 miles per hour, while golden eagles can reach speeds of about 60 miles per hour when chasing jackrabbits. But it's in its vertical dive, or its stoop, as the bird's dive is known, that the peregrine eclipses every other organism. A peregrine was clocked stooping at over 200 miles per hour as it was flying with its skydiving human trainer. But to do that, the peregrine had to dive from heights or an altitude at which the bird rarely hunts. More typical stooping speeds range from about 80 to 150 miles per hour, but still, that's enough to overtake any other living bird. The peregrine, as you can see in this picture, has long pointed wings, relatively stiff flight feathers, powerful, well-developed breast muscles, a streamlined aerodynamic body, and oversized feet and toes to for grabbing prey in flight. So it's perfectly designed to chase, strike, and carry away its avian prey. And peregrines have been remarkably successful. They've been documented feeding on an estimated, or as many as 2,000 different bird species, or 20% of the world's 10,000 or so birds. But back to reintroducing peregrines in Wyoming. Before releasing our juveniles to the wild, we scattered dead quail on top of the cliff and the hackbox to encourage the falcons to stay close and feed once they were released. On release day, our supervisor removed the front of the box so that the birds could fly free. And in these types of reintroductions, the first 24 hours is really critical and a lot can go wrong. For example, a bird in Washington State flew out of its hack box and got carried aloft on a thermal and was never seen again. We also had to worry about predators like golden eagles and great horned owls, and even adult peregrines that could target the inexperienced young falcons as they took their first flights. Hack site attendants like me were on hand to keep track of the newly released birds, to haze away predators using noisemakers, and to feed the young falcons in the days to come. Our peregrines all left the box within a few hours, and luckily all initially stayed nearby. Unfortunately, though, during an afternoon thunderstorm, a side door to our hack box blew shut with a bang and scattered the birds. They all flushed into a violent wind and disappeared. All but one eventually made it back to the vicinity of the hack box by that first night, but you'll have to read the book to find out if our missing peregrine returned. I have to give you at least one teaser for this book. We scattered dead quail on the cliff top each day so that our birds would have plenty of food and stay close by. And we watched over the young falcons from dawn to dusk. And over time, we really began to see their personalities emerge, which made watching them a real delight. The greatest joy of the whole summer, though, was watching these young peregrines learn to fly. We documented their first hesitant flights and their wobbly landings. And we watched them as they mastered their wings and learned how to use the wind. So I'm just going to read a 2-page passage of Feathered Trails to describe what it was like to watch these birds. This passage is about 4 minutes long. The birds also spent more time soaring on updrafts of air, joining other raptors in tracing effortless circular paths on these invisible sky elevators. Most entertaining for us, our peregrines began fine-tuning their flight skills and developing their nascent predatory tendencies with endless pursuits and mock battles. Just as plain kittens developed the agility and strength to catch fleet and elusive prey, so too did the falcons' tireless aerial games fine-tune their bodies to respond to the evasive flights of the shorebirds, songbirds, and waterfowl that evolved over the eons to dodge the speed-made predators that hunted them. Though the wild chases had a playful air, these flights, this practice, would determine whether our peregrines became successful hunters and survivors, or whether they went hungry and perished. Evenings and mornings were now filled with the falcon screams and aerial exploits as one bird streamed after another like a small fighter plane locked onto a fast-moving target. The pursued bird dodged and rolled, tucked its wings, and fell earthward in ever more sophisticated evasive maneuvers. Becoming one with the sky, the peregrines flew with ineffable grace, dazzling speed, and breathtaking agility. As I watched their transcendent flights, I felt my own heart quicken. Transported by the falcon's inimitable aerial prowess, I could almost feel the wind stream behind me, feel every subtle movement of wing or tail that determined my trajectory, my speed, my effortless engagement with the wind. All the while, earthbound, I dispassionately scribbled my field notes, recording our Falcons' flights while never taking my eyes off the birds as they traced invisible loops across the firmament, imprinting their movements, their exuberance, their vitality forever in my mind's eye, and lifting my spirits in ways that only such epiphanic sights in nature can. Small wonder that legendary raptor expert Leslie Brown called the unmatched and unmatchable Peregrine the prince of all flying birds. Now Ra launched from the cliff top and with strong wing beats chased after Isis, who had glided over him, trailing an invisible wake that seemed to pull the young male into motion. Climbing above her, he screamed a challenge, then drew in his wings and dropped toward her at a steep angle. Cacking in protest, Isis tucked a wing, fell away sideways, and rolled over, presenting her ferocious talons. Undaunted, Ra extended his legs and grabbed Isis's talons in his own. Briefly, the two cartwheeled through the sky, their screams echoing off the cliffs and ricocheting over the valley. Seconds later, they released each other, and Isis circled over the cliff before extending her wings, flaring her tail, and landing with an almost imperceptible wobble. And then another tiercel materialized out of the clouds, and the pursuer became the pursued. Drawing his wings close to his body, Osiris dropped toward Ra with breathtaking speed and an agility that the larger-bodied, proportionally shorter-winged Isis could never match. Undaunted, Ra dropped to his side, cacking fiercely as Osiris shot harmlessly past him. Leveling out, Ra flapped his wings, found an updraft, and shot skyward. Circling briefly, he dived at Osiris, and the two sped like nanojets out of view behind the cliffs. Ever watchful and attuned to the world around him, Gawain tilted his head to the right and then left, keeping a close eye on Ra and Osiris's antics from the cliff top as Isis preened assiduously beside him. His large eyes seemed to take in the entirety of the heavens, and he watched his fellow tiercels long after I had lost them from view. Although the open skies were now a significant component of our Falcon's world, our view of the birds was all too often blocked by cliffs, rocks, trees, and hills. But even when I could no longer see our falcons, the trails they had blazed across the sky still lingered in my mind, and the Peregrine's surreal speed and arresting acrobatics, even at this young age, left me awed. Our summer had plenty of adventures, including one of our birds being attacked by a golden eagle. But about 5 weeks after their release, the falcons began to disperse as they learned to hunt for themselves. By 6 weeks post-release, we rarely saw them. After they reached independence, they spent several months fine-tuning their hunting skills before embarking on their first migration. Our juvenile Rocky Mountain peregrines were likely to spend their first winters in Mexico. Meanwhile, the tundra breeding northernmost peregrines leapfrog over wintering Rocky Mountain peregrines and fly as far as southern Argentina or Chile for the austral summer. Some migratory North American peregrines travel almost 16,000 miles from their northern breeding grounds to their winter range and back each year. About half of juvenile peregrines survive their first year. Radio tracking studies have shown that some falcons are lost to predation. Others might die in collisions with cars or buildings or power lines, and some die in storms or are lost at sea. I could only hope that my young peregrines were successful. My time working with them went far too quickly, but it was a life-transforming experience that inspired me to dedicate my career to helping birds. Over time, peregrine introductions like mine, which occurred all over North America, were incredibly successful. Nearly 7,000 peregrines were released to the wild in the US and Canada, and the falcons began to recolonize their former nesting territories. But what really allowed the peregrine to recover was the banning of DDT in 1972. As a top predator, peregrines killed shorebirds, waterfowl, seabirds, and songbirds that had fed on invertebrates, vegetation, and seeds that were contaminated with DDT. And by consuming lots of these birds over time, peregrines accumulated large amounts of DDE, which is a breakdown product of DDT, in their bodies, and this affected their calcium production, which made the birds lay thin-shelled eggs. A similar bioaccumulation of DDE occurred in bald eagles and other fish-eating birds like osprey and pelicans. All of these birds inadvertently crushed their eggs while incubating them, so they couldn't successfully raise any young, which ultimately led to massive population declines. It took many years of dying birds, scientific studies, advocacy, the first ever environmental lawsuits, and public hearings before DDT was finally banned. But rather than learn from the lessons that the peregrine and other birds taught us, today we're experiencing a similar type of environmental catastrophe with a new class of pesticides known as neonicotinoids, or neonics for short. Neonics are less acutely toxic to vertebrates than DDT was, but they're far, far more toxic to insects. And their widespread use has contributed to what many have dubbed an insect apocalypse. We're currently experiencing an ecologically catastrophic disappearance of our insects. Neonics are known as systemic insecticides, meaning that they're absorbed by a plant's roots and leaves, making the entire plant toxic. So insects that feed on any part of the plant, including its fruits and flowers, either die or are debilitated. Neonics are highly soluble in water, so they're transported by runoff from terrestrial to aquatic environments where they can contaminate groundwater and surface water. These pesticides are widely used in agriculture. Seeds of more than 140 crops are pre-coated with neonicotinoids before being planted. And although neonics aren't considered acutely toxic to vertebrates, a single corn seed coated with imidacloprid, which is one of the most widely used and oldest of the neonics, can kill a seed-eating bird the size of a blue jay. And consuming 1/10 of a treated seed daily during the breeding season can disrupt a songbird's ability to reproduce. More than anything, though, it's the disappearance of insects on which so many birds feed that's the biggest cause for alarm. Over time, neonics have had tremendous impact on our ecosystems. Neonics are toxic to earthworms and to the organisms in our soils, to the aquatic invertebrates that feed our fish, to the bees and butterflies that pollinate our plants, and of course to the insects that sustain our birds and bats. So unfortunately, despite the dramatic lessons of the DDT era, we're once again overusing a class of persistent pesticides whose impacts are widespread but still poorly understood. The European Union banned the use of some neonics in 2018. Here in the US, though, we've been much slower to tackle the problem. There's still no federal regulations limiting the use of neonicotinoids, but fortunately, a growing number of towns in a dozen or so states are now starting to curtail or even ban some of their uses. But to end my peregrine discussion on a happy note, peregrines are doing well for now. The bird was removed from the US endangered species list in 1999, and there are now about 3,000 peregrine falcon pairs in North America. So for now, the peregrine is considered a species of low concern, which is amazing to those of us who reintroduced them when they were very endangered. So this has been a real conservation success story. Things have not gone as well for the second species I write about, the Hawaiian crow, or alala, as it's also known, and I'll use these names interchangeably. And again, I mainly want to speak about these other two species that I write about amidst our celebration of the peregrine falcon, so I can compare the reintroductions and conservation to that of the peregrine, and so that I can show that what threatens these birds harms us too. Most people are astonished to hear that any crow anywhere is critically endangered. Most of us know crows to be very opportunistic and able to cope with people and their habitat modifications. But island living crows, especially those that depend on forested habitats, are some of our most endangered birds. The Hawaiian crow is the most endangered corvid in the world, and corvids are members of the crow, raven, jay, and nutcracker family. Despite its name, the Hawaiian crow is more closely related to the common raven than it is to the American crow. It occurs only on the island of Hawaii, also known as the Big Island, where it resides in the cloud forest. A good portion of the alala's forest habitat in Hawaii was destroyed, first by Polynesians and then by European colonizers and the animals that they brought with them. In more recent time, the crows were heavily persecuted. Their numbers were also impacted by introduced predators and diseases. Hawaiian birds evolved on islands that had no mammals other than bats and no reptilian predators either. Their only native predator was the Hawaiian hawk, or the eo, as it's also known in Hawaii. But people introduced rats and mongooses and domestic cats, all of which prey on Hawaiian birds that never evolved to cope with predators. Tree-dwelling rats, like this black rat, consume eggs and nestlings. And if Hawaiian crows were able to evade the rats and leave their nests successfully, they typically spent 2 weeks on the ground, unable to fly. And that strategy worked well in an environment with no predators, but in a world with cats and mongooses, the fledglings were acutely vulnerable to being killed before they were able to fly a couple of weeks after leaving the nest. Feral and outdoor cats also carry diseases. Toxoplasmosis is a cat-transmitted disease that has killed several Hawaiian crows and more than a dozen critically endangered Hawaiian monk seals. And it can also be incredibly harmful to people. Among other concerns, it's being implicated in a number of mental disorders. And you can get the disease by eating contaminated vegetables or undercooked meat, or by cleaning your cat's litter box if you have an outdoor cat, or even by weeding a garden that's visited by outdoor cats. Hawaii's birds have also been decimated by introduced mosquitoes. At one time, Hawaii had no biting insects, so it was truly an avian paradise, and even more of a people paradise than it is already. But mosquitoes were introduced to the islands in 1826, and they became disease vectors that transmitted avian malaria and avian pox, which are two introduced diseases that were fatal to many of Hawaii's birds. Mosquito transmission of these diseases are the major reason why Hawaii is now known as the extinction capital of the world. Many of its native birds, such as some of its renowned honey creepers that I've pictured in the slide, will die after contracting malaria from a single mosquito bite. Most of the native birds in Hawaii now reside at higher elevations where it's cooler and there are fewer mosquitoes. But in our warming climate, mosquitoes can thrive at higher and higher elevations, and soon there's going to be no mosquito-free habitat left for Hawaii's birds. As birds have shown us, introduced organisms which have especially plagued islands like Hawaii, but have been a scourge worldwide, threaten native wildlife, habitats, and humanity. They degrade biodiversity, they cause extinctions, and globally they cost us about $423 billion a year. When I started working on the Hawaiian Crow Recovery Project in the early 1990s, there were only 12 wild alala left. I was tasked with monitoring the first group of captive reared alala that were released to the wild. These 5 juvenile crows had come from eggs that were laid in the wild, and they were raised in captivity. The nestling crows were then transported from the captive breeding facility to the release site and kept in a hack box that was modeled after the Peregrine's hack box for several weeks before being released into the aviary, which was attached to the hack box. After about a month in the aviary, the birds were released to the wild, and I arrived about a week after their release to work with the birds. Along with a field partner, I was tasked with tracking the crows through the cloud forest. They were outfitted with radio transmitters on their tails, and I also monitored their behavior and provided them with food so that until they could forage successfully on their own. The alala were remarkable. They were funny, playful, and just incredibly engaging. They're also really intelligent. They're one of the few bird species that can use tools to secure difficult to reach food items, although this behavior has only been documented in captivity. But perhaps my favorite thing about the alala was the bird's extraordinary voice. The crow has more than 60 different types of calls, and to me, the alala is truly the voice of Hawaii's cloud forest. Today, despite years of reintroductions and or years of effort and numerous reintroductions, Those forests are silent, and the crow exists only in captivity. The bird is extinct in the wild. Surprisingly, one of the greatest challenges to the bird's recovery has been that the Hawaiian hawk, the EO, has killed so many reintroduced birds. Although the two birds coexisted for eons, the balance between the alala and its native predator has been upended. So plans are now underway for reintroducing Hawaiian crows on the island of Maui, where the EO doesn't occur. And apparently reintroductions are set to begin this year. So heartbreaking as the Alala's story is, there's still hope for this captivating bird. And I hope that people will read about it and come to care about this unique crow the way I did, since the bird's future now depends entirely on us. The California condor story is much better known, though most people are more familiar with recovery efforts in California, and I focus more on condor reintroductions in the Grand Canyon region of Arizona. This is the third species that I write about in Feather Trails. For any of you who might be unfamiliar with the condor, it's a member of the New World vulture family, and it's the largest terrestrial land bird in North America with a wingspan of up to 9.5 feet. I love this picture just because when you see a raven up close, they look like such big birds, but this is a raven flying with a condor, and you can get a bit of an idea of the size difference here. The California condor once occurred across much of the US, but in historic times it ranged along the Pacific coast and the interior West. By the 1900s, the bird was restricted largely to California. Condors declined precipitously during the 1800s and 1900s. And when the first successful population census was conducted finally in 1982, biologists were shocked to discover that there are only 22 condors left in existence, with 21 of these in the wild and one in captivity. The birds had been disappearing for decades, but biologists really weren't sure why. Habitat loss and persecution seemed like likely suspects. Many people shot condors, and many more were indirectly killed when they fed on poisoned carcasses that had been left out to kill predators, or put out intentionally to kill predators like wolves, coyotes, and grizzly bears. But after biologists outfitted some of the few remaining condors with radio transmitters on their wings so they could track the birds, they discovered several condors that had died of lead poisoning after ingesting lead ammunition fragments in the carcasses that they had fed on. When lead bullets hit and enter an animal, they lose about 30% of their mass and they fragment into tiny particles, which are then inadvertently consumed by whatever feeds on that animal. It wasn't until years after the first lead poisoned condor was discovered in 1984 that biologists really began to appreciate the severity of this threat to condors. Meanwhile, in the 1980s, condors were disappearing fast. Following the loss of 6 of the 15 condors that remained in the wild during the winter of 1984, the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service decided to capture the last few wild birds to keep them safe and to bolster a new captive breeding program. The last condor was captured in 1987, and it was a very controversial and upsetting thing for a lot of people because no condors flew over North America anymore after that for a while. Fortunately, captive breeding, which was initiated in 1982, was very, very successful. And the first reintroductions of captive reared condors began in California in 1992. These are the blurry picture of the first 2 condors that were released. And then in Arizona, at the Vermilion Cliffs, which are just north of the Grand Canyon, in 1996. I joined the Condor Recovery Program as the field manager of the Arizona reintroduction effort in 2000. And after releasing birds to the wild, my job, along with that of my field crew, was to monitor the birds and keep them safe. We taught newly released condors to roost in places that were safe from predators, like coyotes, and we taught them to stay away from people by hazing them if they perched in inappropriate areas. So the condor in the right-hand corner of your screen is perching in a very inappropriate area. Working with condors was a delight. The birds are gregarious, they're intelligent, and like the Hawaiian crows, they're very, very playful. The birds often played tug of war with a variety of objects, and they seem to delight in punting water bottles, empty water bottles around river beaches with their bills. I have a lot of stories about the playful and entertaining antics of condors in this book. On a more somber note, though, the most critical aspect of my job was keeping condors alive, since they were at constant risk from ingesting lead ammunition in the carcasses that they found. Lead ammunition is the single greatest threat to condors. And to be clear, this is not a hunting issue. Hunting is really beneficial to condors because it provides the birds with so many carcass remains on the landscape. Instead, it's just an ammunition issue. If it weren't for lead ammunition, condors would be thriving. The black and white specks in these x-rays of a shot deer and a coyote are lead fragments. And so you can see how birds that gather together on a carcass and feed on carcasses like these could ingest small particles of lead, which were enough to poison them. So what about people who eat hunter-killed game? Are they vulnerable too? To investigate this, a North Dakota doctor x-rayed 100 packages of venison that had been donated to local food banks by hunters in 2007. And 59% of the packages that he x-rayed contained visible lead fragments. So in this picture, the white flecks are little pieces of lead. This is a photo of some of the packages that he x-rayed. After these findings were publicized, other states x-rayed venison that had been donated by hunters to their food banks, and they also found alarming lead levels. But despite these findings years ago now, food bank donations of hunter-killed meat are still unregulated, and donor organizations, as far as I've been able to determine, don't require their hunters to use non-lead ammunition. So we worry about lead in our pipes and in our children's toys, and yet every year hunters are donating millions of pounds of game meat shot with lead to the needy and eating such meat themselves. And this kind of lead consumption could be having profoundly negative health and societal outcomes. Scores of medical doctors, public health experts, and scientists have highlighted the human health threat posed by lead ammunition and called for the use of safer types of ammunition for hunting. Non-lead bullets that don't fragment are now widely available, and their use prevents the poisoning of condors, eagles, ravens, and a host of other scavengers, as well as being healthier for people. No level of lead is considered safe for people, and toxic lead effects are largely irreversible. But despite that, hunter advocacy groups like the NRA and some other groups say there's no cause for concern. We've been hunting with lead bullets for years and no one's ever been harmed by it. But the effects of lead can be subtle and they're often attributed to other causes. For example, in adults, chronic lead effects can include high blood pressure, decreased kidney function, reproductive issues such as impotence and miscarriages. It may be related to cognitive decline and dementia in older adults, and it reduces longevity. In children, lead can lower IQ levels and lead to learning disabilities and a higher frequency of delinquent and aggressive behavior. Lead exposure has also been linked to criminality. A number of studies attribute the widespread declines in violent crime in the 1990s to the phasing out of leaded gasoline in the late 70s and early 1980s. But we still have no idea if and how ingesting lead ammunition might be contributing to the violence and crime that we see today. We're very good at ignoring the warning signs that birds are telling us that things are in our environment are dangerous. We've known that lead bullets are poisoning California condors since the 1980s, and it's hard to imagine ignoring a bigger, sootier canary in the coal mine, but that's exactly what we've been doing. Fortunately, though, things are starting to change. To help condors, California banned the use of lead ammunition beginning in 2019. But it's still remarkable to me that we rarely hear about the human health aspects of lead ammunition, and most states aren't even discussing the problem. Despite the existential threat that lead ammunition poses to condors, though, reintroductions and intensive management have significantly bolstered the condor population since its low point of 22 birds. Condors are now reproducing successfully in the wild, and they're reclaiming more and more of their former range. Their success for the time being, though, is dependent on very intensive management. If that were to stop, condors would decline again because of the lead poisoning threat. Nevertheless, thanks to the Endangered Species Act and thousands of dedicated people, these three incredible species are still with us today. The peregrine falcon is one of our biggest conservation success stories. First and foremost, the peregrine taught us that birds can alert us to environmental harms. The bird became the poster bird for the perils of DDT, which were incredibly harmful to other wildlife and to people too. In addition, techniques that were used to recover the peregrine have helped to inform all sorts of other conservation efforts, including efforts to recover the Hawaiian crow and the California condor. And finally, the peregrine story taught us that the best way to recover a species is to eliminate its main threat. In the peregrine's case, that meant eliminating the pesticide DDT. Not eliminating the main threat to a species often undermines its recovery, as we're seeing with the California condor. But if we can replace lead ammunition with non-lead ammunition, we'll be able to save the condor too. The Hawaiian crow faces multiple complex threats, which inevitably makes its recovery a lot more challenging. In addition, funding and recovery efforts were inadequate for many decades until it was almost too late. Hawaiian birds, which are some of our most endangered birds, are still underfunded compared to mainland species. But the peregrine and other recovered birds have shown us that targeted conservation efforts really do work. We really can make a difference when people and entities come together to try to conserve birds. We've had tremendous success recovering endangered species with targeted conservation efforts. But along the way, we've come to realize that our best conservation strategy is to keep common birds common and to prevent birds from becoming endangered in the first place. And that's where I think bird lovers like us can come in. At last count, the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service estimated that there are 96 million of us who watch and love birds. And if all of us, or even a small portion of that 96 million, do a few small things to help birds, then we might be able to turn around their declining populations. For example, we can keep our cats indoors. That's the biggest one, since that's the biggest threat to birds generally. We can put decals on our windows. We can, to prevent bird collisions, we can avoid using pesticides around our homes, grow native plants, buy organic foods, use non-lead ammunition, and convince other people to use non-lead ammunition, and support our public lands and bird conservation organizations. Those are just a few suggestions. There are countless other ways we can help our local birds, and I try to provide additional suggestions whenever I write about birds. By doing so, by taking small steps to help birds, we not only enrich our own lives by supporting the bird life around us, but we're also likely to save a host of other species and other creatures that share our planet as well. Thanks to all of you for listening to that whirlwind tour. And thank you to the beautiful peregrine falcon, which has taught us so much about bird conservation and inspired so many of us along the way. Feather Trails is now available in bookstores and online in hardback, Kindle, and audiobook versions. And I'm happy to take any questions that you may have.
All right. Thank you so much. A virtual round of applause for Sophie Osborn. Thank you so much. Really appreciate it here. Yeah, if you guys have questions, go ahead and put them in the chat here, and then I can call on you guys to unmute and ask your questions in person. But I do see one here right off the bat. So Dana, you've got a couple of questions there. So would you like to unmute yourself and ask your question? Oh, can't unmute. Okay, cool. So I'll ask for you. No worries. So Dana's question was, which of these projects was your favorite?
It's impossible to say because they were each so different. I think probably each time I was in a particular project, I thought it was my favorite. But I have to say that one of my main motivations for writing this book was to draw attention to the Hawaiian crow because they're so unique, they're so remarkable. I just love their vocalizations and being in the cloud forest with them so much. And they're so imperiled, and very few people know about them. So I was particularly wanting to bring attention to them. That said, I worked longest with condors, and they're so playful and so entertaining and funny that I just every day seeing them fly was a thrill, and being with them was a delight. But then again, there's nothing quite like seeing a peregrine fly. So I really enjoyed that time too. I really have enjoyed most of the species that I've worked with. I've been lucky to be out in the field with them.
Okay, so what I heard there was Peregrine.
Oh, that's right. Yeah, it was all peregrines because we are celebrating peregrines. Hard to
No,
beat a peregrine.
obviously all amazing birds to be working with in their own regards. There was a bonus question. What is your spark bird?
My spark bird was actually a hooded merganser, and I had just started taking a field ornithology class, and I really saw myself as a mammal person at first. I was not originally drawn to birds, but I started getting interested in them when I started taking this field ornithology class. And I just happened to see a hooded merganser one day on my way home from school, and I had never seen anything like it outside of a zoo. And I just remember calling all my friends and telling them that, oh my God, you would not believe this incredible, colorful, amazing bird that I saw. So that was the one that got me started. Followed soon after by the American kestrel, which I saw near my house. And I couldn't believe that something so colorful and beautiful lived around me. And I never even noticed it before. I came to the birding world a little late after college. So it was a thrill.
I mean, as far as spark birds go, both of those are pretty solid stunners. I see a next one from Sunny Tompkins. Sunny, do you want to unmute and ask your question? Oh, got another one I can't unmute. No worries. Sunny just wants to know, what's your next project? What's the next big thing you're working on?
I'm not sure what my next project will be. I've been writing about birds more than working with them lately, although I'm monitoring peregrine falcons tomorrow morning. My local peregrine, one of my many local peregrine territories is what I'll be doing tomorrow. I'm also working on another book at the moment. We're trying to find a publisher for it, which is an anthology, a collection of field stories by and about women biologists. And I'm working with another biologist on this, and we solicited stories from women biologists. Our request went viral, and we received submissions from all over North America and beyond. And so we've put together this collection of really incredible stories about the work that women field biologists are doing in the field. So that's another project that I'm trying to wrap up. And after that, I'm not sure. I need to get a job and earn some money because writing about birds is not lucrative for all of us. But those are the main things I have going on at the moment. And I also write a blog called Words for Birds on the Substack platform, and so check that one out. That's an ongoing project.
Honestly, if I had time to read all these books, they sound amazing. Keep
I
them coming though.
know.
I got a
There's
question.
audiobooks now. So my sisters read audiobooks while they're doing their dishes and things like that. So that's a way to go. And there is
Honestly,
Feather
I've
Trails
been
is it
dipping
on
my
in an
toe.
audiobook.
I feel like I should probably get more into that because you're right. There's how much time you spend on your commutes or doing your chores
Exactly.
where that can be something. I got a question here. If you have an example of the vocalizations for um for the crow.
I don't at the moment, and the Merlin app does not do it justice. I when I first checked out some of the bird apps to see if they would capture the Hawaiian crows, I was quite disappointed. Uh, the Fish and Wildlife Service used to have an entire page dedicated to the Hawaiian crows vocalizations, which I loved. They're that unusual and that amazing. But they were so variable, and I tried to describe them a lot in my book. So it's not quite the same thing as hearing them, but hopefully there's some descriptions in there. But just to give you an idea of the variety, at night, they had these quiet murmurations that sounded like zippers and whispering and little mewings, just a wonderful collection of strange and comforting sounds. In the morning, they had a call that was just like a jolt of caffeine, and it cracked me up because my one of my supervisors called it the James Brown call, and the birds would go in the morning, and the whole cloud forest would ring with that loud wake up call. And then they had everything in between. So you probably can just look online for them, but just know that they probably don't do them justice because the variety is astonishing and they're truly unique and captivating.
All right, I got another question here from Birch Davis, who clarified that they don't have a mic, so thank you for sparing me the awkward pause. So I'll go ahead and read their question, which is there a difference in lead uptake in condors between bullets and slugs and shotgun pellets? Having eaten animals hunted with shot, it was pretty easy as a human to spit them out.
Right. And condors have been killed by both, by lead shot and by lead bullet fragments. And I think people expected lead shot maybe, but it was after I started working with condors that people started x-raying carcasses that had been shot with rifle bullets and realizing how much those bullets fragmented into just tiny particles. I mean, on x-rays, some of it's just powder. So they would not be able to pick those out. And they, obviously could easily get poisoned by them. Most of the hunters who were on our condor project, once they saw those x-rays, they all switched to non-lead ammunition because it's almost impossible to remove all the lead. Even if as a hunter you cut around the channel where the bullet entered, the spread of that powdery residue and those tiny fragments is substantial enough that it's hard to miss. But the very first lead poisoning incident that we had in Arizona, which was shocking to everybody, even though we probably should have expected it. That was a carcass that was filled with lead shot, and the birds ate several different sizes of lead shot. And we don't know if it was like a range cattle that somebody had shot up or what it was that had so many different or several different sizes of lead pellets, but both of them are harmful. But lead bullet fragments is the one that is more commonly now the problem.
I have another question here from Sophie Z, who's pointing out that they are lucky enough to have both American crows and peregrine falcons in their neighborhood here in Chicago. But they're wondering if peregrines are a threat to crows. Do peregrines predate them? And do crows in turn mob peregrines?
Those are great questions, and I don't know because I haven't interacted with crows and peregrines at the same time. However, I know I would suspect that peregrines, being very opportunistic, if they could get a crow, they would get a crow. And I know that they have killed American crows. So I would imagine that a peregrine would target a crow. And knowing crows as much as I do, I would be quite sure they would mob a peregrine given a chance. So often, though, peregrines will do what's called ringing up, and they will circle up super high and hit crows from above. So I don't know if they would have an opportunity to mob a peregrine, but that's part of the great things about crows hanging out together. They are very good at mobbing, dangerous predators. So that doesn't help very much. Those are speculations based on my bit of knowledge about crows and my bit of knowledge about peregrine. And if you see anything in your neighborhood, I would love to hear about it. It sounds like you live in a great spot.
I'll add that I've personally seen crows mob peregrines
Have you?
once or twice, but
Yeah,
definitely not
good.
not as a common thing.
Right.
Crows freaking out, it's a hawk or an owl.
And I would suspect it'd be most often if a peregrine was perching somewhere near a crow, then I bet the crows would mob it and go after it.
All right, any other questions? Once, going twice.
Thanks for the fun variety.
All right, and then I think I'll go ahead and close it out here then. So once again, thank you everybody for joining us. A big virtual round of applause here for Sophie. Thank you
Thank
so much for
you.
taking the time this evening to just spend an evening with us and talking about your work. Definitely, if you've got a chance, there's a discount code right up there. Get your copy of the book if you can. I know I'm overdue to order my copy as well here. But thank you once again for joining us. Thank you all for joining us this evening. Definitely check out the Chicago Ornithological Society website for future events and the rest of the events as part of this year, the Peregrine series. And we will see you guys on the next program. But with that said, have a great evening and take care.
Thank you very much. Thanks for having me.